Rod Serling is the only writer to have won 3 Emmy Awards for Requiem for a Heavyweight, Patterns, The Comedian. Paddy Chayefsky has talked about the insidious influence of what he calls pre-censorship. How does that work?
Pre-censorship is a practice, I think, of most television writers. I can't speak for all of them. This is the prior knowledge of the writer of those areas which are difficult to try to get through. And so a writer will shy away from writing those things which he knows he's going to have trouble with on a sponsorial or an agency level. We practice it all the time. We just do not write those themes which we know are going to get into trouble.
Who's the culprit? Is it the network, the sponsor, which sure is not the FCC?
No, it's certainly not the FCC, ideally speaking, of course. It's a combination of culprits in this case, Mike. It's partly network. It's principally agency and sponsor. In many ways, I think it's the audience themselves.
How do you mean?
Well, I'll give you an example. About a year ago, roughly 11 or 12 months ago, on the Lassie show, this is a story usually told by Sheldon Leonard, who was then associated with the show. Lassie was having puppies, and I have 2 little girls, then aged 5 and 3, who are greatly enamored of this beautiful collie, and they watched the show with great interest, and Lassie gave birth to puppies. And Mike, it was probably one of the most tasteful and delightful and warm things depicting what is this wondrous thing that is birth. And after the show, I think there were many congratulations all around, because it was a lovely show. The sort of thing I'd love my kids to watch, to show them what is the birth process and how marvelous it is. They got many, many cards and letters. Sample card from the Deep South, this was. If I wanted my kids to watch sex shows, I wouldn't have had them turn on that. I could take them to burlesque shows. And as a result of the influx of mail, many of the cards, incidentally, as Sheldon tells it, were postmarked at identical moments, all in the same handwriting, but each was counted as a singular piece of mail. And as a result, the directive went down that there would be no shows having anything to do with puppies, that is, in the actual birth process. Well, obviously, it is this wild lunatic fringe of letter writers that greatly affect what the sponsor has in mind.
You can understand the position of the sponsor, can't you?
In many ways, I suppose I can. He's there to push a product.
He has a considerable stake, thus, in what goes on the air.
Most assuredly. And in those cases where there is a problem of public taste, in which there is a concern for eliciting negative response from a large mass of people, I can understand why the guys are frightened.
Sure.
I don't understand, Mike, for example, other evidences and instances of intrusion by sponsors. For example, on Playhouse 90, not a year ago, a lovely show called Judgment at Nuremberg. I think probably one of the most competently done and artistically done pieces that 90's done all year. In it, as you recall, mention was made of gas chambers.
Yeah.
And the line was deleted, cut off the soundtrack. And it mattered little to these guys that the gas involved in concentration camps was cyanide, which bore no resemblance, physical or otherwise, to the gas used in stoves. They cut the line.
Because the sponsor was...
He did not want that awful association made between what was the horror and the misery of Nazi Germany with the nice chrome, wonderfully antiseptically clean, beautiful kitchen appliances that they were selling.
Yeah.
Now, this is an example of sponsor interference which is so beyond logic and which is so beyond taste. This I rebel against.
You've got a new series coming up called The Twilight Zone. You are writing as well as acting executive producer on this one. Who controls the final product, you or the sponsor?
We have what I think, at least theoretically anyway, because it hasn't really been put into practice yet, a good working relationship, where in questions of taste, in questions of the art form itself, in questions of drama, I'm the judge, because this is my medium and I understand it. I'm a dramatist for television. This is the area I know. I've been trained for it. I've worked for it for 12 years. And the sponsor knows his product, but he doesn't know mine. So when it comes to the commercials, I leave that up to him. When it comes to the story content, he leaves it up to me.
Has nothing been changed in the...
We changed in 18 scripts, Mike. We have had one line changed, which again was a little ludicrous, but of insufficient basic concern within the context of the story, not to put up a fight. On the bridge of a British ship, a sailor calls down to the galley and asks, in my script, for a pot of tea, because I believe that it's constitutionally acceptable in the British Navy to drink tea.
Yeah.
One of my sponsors happens to sell instant coffee, and he took great umbrage, or at least minor umbrage anyway,
yeah,
with the idea of saying tea. Well, we had a couple of swings back and forth, nothing serious, and we decided we'd ask for a tray to be sent up to the bridge. But in 18 scripts, that's the only conflict we've had. Well, these are very adult, I think high quality, half-hour, extremely polished films. But because they deal in the areas of fantasy and imagination and science fiction and all of those things, there's no opportunity to cop a plea or chop an axe or anything.
Well, you're not going to be able to cop a plea or chop an axe because you're going to be obviously working so hard on the Twilight Zone that, in essence, for the time being and for the foreseeable future, you've given up on writing anything important for television, right?
Yeah. Again, this is a semantic thing. Important for television, I don't know. If by important you mean I'm not going to try to delve into current social problems dramatically, you're quite right, I'm not.
Well, then why do you stay in television?
I stay in television because I think it's very possible to perform a function of providing adult, meaningful, exciting, challenging drama without dealing in controversy necessarily. This, of course, Mike, is not the best of all possible worlds. I am not suggesting that this is at the absolute millennium. I think it's criminal that we're not permitted to make dramatic note of social evils as they exist, of controversial themes as they are inherent in our society. I think it's ridiculous that drama, which by its very nature should make a comment on those things that affect our daily lives, is in the position, at least in terms of television drama, of not being able to take this stand. But these are the facts of life. This is the way it exists. And they can't look to me or Shaevsky or Rose or Gore Vidal or J.P. Miller or any of these guys as the precipitators of the big change. It's not for us to do it. Prior to Paddy Chayefsky, most of us were considered to be two-headed hacks who worked around the clock and used boy-girl situations in any one of 5,000 different routine manners. But Paddy gave us a stature. And I respect Paddy's decision to leave. He felt that he wasn't satisfied with doing things half-best.
Herb Brodkin, who was a TV producer who was associated with some of your earlier plays, has said this about you. He said, Rod is either going to stay commercial or become a discerning artist, but not both.
I remember the quote. He gave it to Gilbert Milstein when Milstein was doing a profile on me in the New York Times. I didn't understand it at the time. I failed to achieve any degree of understanding in the ensuing years, which are 3 in number. I presume Herb means that inherently you cannot be commercial and artistic. You cannot be commercial and quality. You cannot be commercial concurrent with having a preoccupation with the level of storytelling that you want to achieve. And this I have to reject. I think you can be, I don't think calling something commercial tags it with a kind of an odious suggestion that it stinks, that it's something raunchy to be ashamed of. I don't think if you say commercial means to be publicly acceptable, what's wrong with that? As long, the essence of my argument, Mike, is that as long as you are not ashamed of anything you write, if you're a writer, as long as you're not ashamed of anything you perform if you're an actor, and I'm not ashamed of doing a television series.
With science fiction on television, what was your first encounter with
the first serious encounter in television science fiction form, Jim, would have been, I'm having a lot of trouble with that cigarette, aren't I? I think God is telling me don't smoke. A fairly obscure show that people don't remember called the Desilu Playhouse. This was back in about, I'd guess 1956. And I did a time travel piece with Bill Bendix, the name of which, strangely enough, eludes me at this given moment, though I should remember it. It was the first shot out of the Time Element it was called, and got tremendous reaction. And because of its reaction, the network, the CBS network, who I had approached over the past 3 years to try to get something in the science fiction genre on, took another second look at it. And as a result, I got Twilight Zone on. But that time travel thing was the first essentially serious thing I had done.
What led you to this field?
Of course, see, I love science fiction, but I'm an aficionado, not a contributor. And I say this, with no stupid, dumb humility at all. I'm purely a Johnny-come-lately. I am perhaps the least scientifically knowledgeable man in the whole writing group, and I bow with great deference and respect to the real masters, Asimov and Bob Heinlein and Sturgeon and all the rest of them. And these, of course, and yourself included, because you write pure science fiction. I can adapt science fiction, I think, quite adequately, but I can't create it on an original level. But if I had a group of stories to select, I think by virtue of its mass media form, I would try to choose those stories that, though even science fiction and genre, would be tellable in terms of the most acceptable human terms that we now know. I would probably shy away from the year 2500. I would much rather deal in 1998. The hardware that I use, I think, should be identifiable. Different, of course, because it changes every year. But I would be more prone to think in terms of, I'd like to know what happens Thursday, not in the next century.
Twilight Zone went on the air when? What?
1959 through 1962.
And what was the reaction to it in general? I mean, the first year, what happened?
Of course, you see, you have to gauge that in the strange arithmetic of television, which is very close to insanity. I think in its best run, Twilight Zone got roughly a 31 or a 32 share, which in television terms says that it is a mild success. It is not a runaway hit, it's not Gunsmoke, and it's a very questionable item as to whether or not we'll renew it if indeed something else comes along that looks much more publicly acceptable. It's sufficiently healthy to warrant their continuing to take a look at it. Now, what that 31 share meant was approximately 25 million people watching, which is a fair-sized audience. That's more than watched Shakespeare, you know, during the first 100 years. But in the strange, again, as I say, the strange arithmetic of television, this was not considered a major show. Oddly enough, the show became more popular after it went off the air in terms of the name Twilight Zone being kind of interchangeable with, you know, strange little witticisms throughout our language. It became a funny little colloquialism that people used.
It's still running, isn't it?
It's running intermittently all over the country and all over the world. It's been on 39 foreign stations, too. And I've seen it in Japan. There they call it the Mystery Zona. And there I speak Japanese by moving my lips for 2 seconds and the voice continuing on for 32 minutes. And then it's done in pure Castilian Spanish and in several other languages.
Do you still get reactions from people about
yes,
it?
Indeed.
I mean,
frequently.
People,
I still get, oddly enough, a massive amount of unsolicited material sent to me because it seems of all the writing milieu, the whole concept of fantasy and science fiction is that which appeals to the non-writer, at least the non-professional writer, the most. When Night Gallery went on the air, Jim, I bet I've received on the average of 100 pieces of mail per week with manuscripts. And of course I can't entertain reading all of those things because of the legal hassle involved, and also by virtue of the fact that 99% of the writing that arrives on the desk of a mass media guy is pretty therapeutic writing. These are people who generally preface by saying, I ain't such a good writer, but I got this real good idea in my dream after eating the rancid mayonnaise, and I will let you write and we'll split, this kind of thing.
Were you pleased, satisfied with what you did on the Twilight Zone, ultimately?
I think overall, it lacked consistency. It wasn't a good show every week. It wasn't a good show sometimes 3 weeks running. But judging it on the basis of other television shows, I think we maintained a reasonable consistency. I think we had what I would also attribute to a show like Playhouse 90. We showed effort constantly. I think at times we showed ingenuity and creativity. I don't think we borrowed from anyone. I think we created more than we aped.
Which were you most pleased with, or which stick out in your mind?
Oddly enough, I thought the two best shows we did, one I wrote, one I didn't write. One was an original by Dick Matheson called The Invaders, with Agnes Moorehead, which was in a sense pure science fiction with a very O. Henry-ish twist. And the other was an adaptation of mine, a very free, loose adaptation of a Lucille Fletcher's, I think it was Lucille Fletcher, I could be wrong, a short story called Time Enough at Last, about a myopic bank teller who at the end of the world breaks his glasses just when he's able to read all that he's ever wanted to read, which was sheer, pure, beautiful irony. And in terms of production values, the adaptation I mentioned was gorgeously done. We used an MGM backlot with existing sets that were already there, and it looked like a movie. Poor Dick Matheson, on the other hand, suffered what is really one of the clinical problems of doing science fiction on TV. This desperately required 8-inch little men to walk across the floor of a room, and suddenly we are made aware of the fact that this woman who we thought was normal is actually an extraterrestrial giant, and the two men who are the invaders are actually really young American astronauts. So all we could use, because we couldn't afford opticals and we couldn't afford montage effects, were little wind-up rubber men, and they walked precisely like little wind-up rubber men. And I thought it totally destroyed the illusion and pointed out to me, you know, the desperate built-in problems to doing proper science fiction on television.
What would you do differently today if you were going to produce another Twilight Zone?
I would never try to shoot it in 3 days, which was one of the hang-ups we had. I would get at least 2 days rehearsal for a cast. We had 2 to begin with, then it was cut to 1, then we rehearsed on the set with no rehearsal time. That was the first thing. I would never try to beat my head against a wall trying to come in at what was an arbitrary budget at the time. We simply couldn't do it properly. What we wound up doing was a very exuberant type of show, a very ambitious scoped show 1 week, and then have to suffer for it with 1 set drama for 4 weeks to pay off what we'd already done. And this, I think, lent a discrediting thing to the consistency of the quality of the show. In terms of story material, Jim, I don't think we would deviate very much from what we had already done. I thought we had some exceptionally good stuff on. And in the few years that have passed since Twilight Zone was on, there has appeared another whole new generation, a new body of marvelous science fiction and fantasy that we could yet again draw on. And then came Star Trek, but none of those shows were remotely imitative. They stood on their own feet or fell, whichever the case may be. Star Trek, we discussed it earlier privately, I thought was again a very inconsistent show, which at times sparkled with true ingenuity and pure science fiction approaches, and other times was more carnival-like and very much more the creature of television than the creature of a legitimate literary form. There was one previous show that was sort of the granddaddy of all the television science fiction, and this was done on the old DuPont network. Gosh, I wish I could think of the name of it. I love this desperate knowledge of mine that I come out with. And this did a lot of marvelous adaptations, and some very good ones. The Adaptive Ultimate, do you recall that?
Yes,
Sure.
yes, that was
Kind of a little classic.
Stanley Weinbaum.
That's right, and a very good show,
Yes,
which
I
they
remember
did
that.
on that.
I remember that.
Something About Tomorrow was in the title. Tales of Tomorrow,
Tales of
that was the
Tomorrow.
name of the
Ah,
show,
yes,
produced
that's
by Mort Abrams on the old DuPont network, which I think later became ABC. But that truly was the granddaddy. But in terms of your question, no, very little imitation.
What do you think the future of science fiction is on television?
I have a fairly sanguine view of it, Jim. I think hopefully we're going to see a great deal more science fiction. I think at the moment it is being stultified by the current desperate economics of our place out there, that they're being terribly timorous in all new areas of storytelling only because it costs a buck. But I think this is very temporal. I think it's truly the only pure, fresh area of a brand new storytelling form and fresh, ingenious ideas that we have.